Hi, everyone. It's Stephanie with the patient story, and I'm really happy to introduce you to our guest today, Dennis, who's been really kind to share his time with us to tell us about his experience after he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Well, Dennis, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm glad to share my story with you.
Yeah, and I know, Dennis, that you have done a lot of patient advocacy work really in helping other people through their times. We'll make sure to talk about that towards the end of our interview here. But you're over in Connecticut. Anything you want to just say about yourself before we start? Because I know you're about way more than cancer.
Well, a couple of things. I'm married. I've got a couple of kids, and they're all grown adults and successful and living in all various parts of the country. And we're here in Connecticut enjoying right now the beginnings of winter. So it's kind of a fun thing. But as you said, I was diagnosed in 2013 with prostate cancer, and we can get into that certainly. And it was after that that I began realizing that so many men had really no idea of what prostate cancer is, the fact they even have a prostate. And at that particular point, I got together with a buddy of mine, and we started the National Prostate Cancer Awareness Foundation. Because what we were finding is that people basically were not aware. We found organizations that helped people who had cancer.
Right.
There were people who were raising money for research, but no one was talking to guys about, hey, wake up, you need to go and get an annual checkup. So that's kind of the niche we started, but we'll talk about more of that later.
Definitely, but I'm glad you introduced that, ahead of time because it's such a critical message. And so hopefully your story here on the patient story will go along to further that mission, Dennis. So let's dive into what happened. I know you had mentioned it was over about 18 months or so when you started noticing some first symptoms. Can you describe what was going on?
Yeah, basically what was happening is that I was finding that I was getting up a little bit more at night, and I was getting up maybe once or twice a night, which I had never done before. And the urine flow seemed to be a little bit slower. So I went into my general practitioner and I said, some things seem to be happening here. And he said, well, at your age, it's probably just an enlarged prostate. And so they started me on some medications to help the flow. In the meantime, I had already gone through with that general physician or general GP a digital examination. I had been going through regularly annual physicals. So he was watching my PSA numbers all along and kept saying all along, you're in the normal range. And when you're a guy, the doctor says you're in the normal range, you say, that's great, bye now. I don't need to ask any more questions.
Right.
And so that kept going along. And he kept saying normal range, normal range. And it was in, I guess, 18 months after that started that I went in one time for an annual physical. And he said, your numbers are still in the normal range, but they're kind of getting on the high side. You might, and I repeat that, you might want to go and talk to a urologist. And of course, I said to my wife, I might want to go to a urologist. And my wife said, no, you want to go to a urologist. So in I go, and with all of the, fear of going in, and somebody said to me, this is going to be your first bat mitzvah, and which I thought was a great expression. And I said, okay, and went in, and we had a conversation, and he said, well, a couple of things. He said, so many times general practitioners will say you're in a normal range, but what they're failing to recognize is something called PSA velocity. And velocity means that your numbers are going up on a steady basis. He said, so a normal range may be normal, but velocity is something that really needs to be watched. And he said, probably 90% of men have no idea. They look at a number and they say, well, my number's low.
Right.
Your general practitioner can be the same way, and it depends on what kind of training they had.
Right.
So over the course of my illness here, I've discovered there are general practitioners who say it's okay for a guy to have a PSA of 2. It's okay for a guy to have a PSA of 5. It's okay for a guy to have a PSA of 3.5. So it really depends on what that physician has read and what the trigger number is for him or her. And what the urologist pointed out was, look, there's no magic number. So there's no point where you say, now at this number, you see a urologist. He said, basically, you want to see if that velocity is rising. And if it's rising, you want to see a urologist, which I did. And so it got to a point where, I went in and so he explained all of that. And he said, well, I'm going to do a digital examination. And I said, where's the computer? And he said, no, a digital examination. I said, okay, I now understand digital. And that digital exam was quite different than anything I had had with a general practitioner. And the GP probably, does a routine check. And the prostate is a difficult gland to examine. And many times the irregularity, if you will, appears on the back side of the prostate. And your general practitioner may or may not feel it. So what happens in this case is I had the digital examination and my ears got cleaned out, I think, in the process. And he said to me, I feel an irregularity. And my heart sank at that particular point.
The
And
urologist had been able to actually reach the area where it was going to show the irregularity. And
exactly. And at that particular point, he said, well, we need to do a biopsy. And well, how do we do that? And then I started to do a little bit of research on how this is done. And I hear of guys passing out in the middle of it. I hear all kinds of issues on it. Of course, you do exactly what you're not supposed to do. You go online,
right.
And then you read every horror story that was ever created by man on the internet. And so I did go in for the biopsy. They did use a form of Novocaine, which was a little bit of a joy to have as well to start. And then they started to do a scan, and I could actually see the screen. And I could see there were red spots that were showing up in 2 areas. They did the biopsy. They did a 12-core biopsy. And of the 12 cores, 2 were positive. And they said, okay, we'll get back to you with a score. Well, I'm now down in New York City a week later or 2 weeks later. I'm driving back and my phone rings. And it's the urologist office. And the person on the phone says, well, we just wanted to let you know you've got prostate cancer.
Just like that.
And I went, okay. Is there anything else you can tell me? Well, it's kind of aggressive. What do you mean kind of aggressive? Well, out of a 10, you've got a 9. And I said, well, at least I'm not a 10. So then I spent the next 2.5 hours driving from New York City back to Connecticut with that information.
Oh, gosh.
And I didn't know what to say to my wife when I came home. So, yeah, I know.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. That's just.
I'll tell you though, I'm not alone. I've talked to so many men who have had similar situations.
Right.
Or worse, some of them say, well, the doctor called up and said, well, you really need to come in. We need to talk.
Right.
I can get you in 2 weeks. Now, you're sitting at home for 2 weeks or a week and a half, waiting to go in. And it's an issue and nobody will talk to you. So I don't know which is worse, hearing it quickly and getting the information and saying, okay, or whether you hang there by your fingernails and go, what level is this?
Right.
But the thing is, I think, the doctors deal with this all the time. And for them, well, yeah, you've got prostate cancer. Okay, we're going to take care of it. And for you, it's, I have what? I have cancer, and it scares the bejesus out of you. And you panic because I think we all know when you hear the word cancer, it's quite different. And I've said this a number of times. If you know someone who has cancer, there's one reaction. If someone says to you, you have cancer, it's a whole different reaction, believe me.
Absolutely. And for you to have to digest all that. But I'm glad you pointed it out. I mean, there is a varying range of the way people tell you, the way doctors will tell you. It's on the phone. Mine was on the phone. You had the Band-Aid sort of ripped off. You were driving,
Exactly.
Right? Or you have to come in, but I can't get you in just yet. It's kind of such a bizarre, bizarre is not even the start of it, but it's a terrible experience actually. So Dennis, before we move on, that biopsy, thanks for explaining some of it. I think, like you said, people get really nervous about biopsy is a scary word, and in this context as well. So you had Novocaine shots locally, and then what exactly do they do for the biopsy?
Well, basically, if you can imagine, how do I put this politely, a golf ball on a stick is basically what is inserted. And in that golf ball, they have the ability to fire a needle, and that needle can inject Novocaine. And then from there, they can take the biopsy. And typically, most organizations take 12 samples and they try to use some sort of a guided system to find out where the hot spots are. Some hospitals, I believe it's Johns Hopkins, takes as many as 24.
Mm.
So, so you're kind of anticipating that needle hitting X number of times, and it gets a little exciting. Some of them were fine. Some of them were a little engaging, shall we say.
Okay.
And when it's over, they say, here, take some antibiotics so you don't have an infection, because obviously the area they're working in and they're puncturing through the rectum
Right.
can lead to an infection. And then after it, you may have some bleeding, which I did. So all that's sort of distressing, to say the least.
Sure.
But then everything calms down, and then you wait to hear the news.
Right.
And at that particular point, then they told me that I had a Gleason score. And Gleason scores, as I said, go to 10, but it's a combination of two numbers. And mine happened to be a 4.5 and a 5.4. So they were quite high. The good news was it was confined to one side of the prostate, and only 2 of the 12 were positive.
Mm.
So high score contained within the prostate. So that's what they felt. And the question was, we need to let you heal before we can do surgery.
Right.
So then it was on April 15th, which I refer to as a doubly taxing day. I went into the hospital,
Right.
and I left my prostate in Hartford, Connecticut.
You're so poetic, Dennis, the way that you describe these things. Before we get into that story, I wanted to ask, I know you had already mentioned this. Well, there's actually 2 questions. One is, I know typically when people talk about cancer and they're worried about a diagnosis, they think of staging, which I know is different with prostate cancer. But was there ever any mention of that? I mean,
Well, the staging is the Gleason score. And
right.
so if you have a Gleason score of 6 or less, it's considered a slow-growing cancer. Now, my business partner was diagnosed several years ago with a Gleason 6. Went in, he had open surgery, and that was 15 years ago, and had no reoccurrence at all. And but he still every year goes to the urologist
Right.
and still keeps checking just to keep that ongoing system in place, rather than. And so many guys, I had another fellow I was working with who went to his regular GP afterwards, and his GP kept saying to him, well, your numbers are normal, don't worry about it, your numbers are normal. And so at one particular point, his GP said to him, well, you know, your prostate, your PSA number is now up to a 2, and maybe you should get it checked. And he said, well, that's kind of an issue, because I was operated on and don't have a prostate, and haven't had one now for 6 years. So the advantage here is that if you're dealing with this cancer, you really want to continue with a urologist. And you also want to be sure that the type of PSA test they're doing is an ultrasensitive test, because there's 2 levels of PSA testing. One is the normal testing, but after surgery, they do an ultrasensitive test. So
Right.
you're getting readings that are in the 0.01, 0.02 kinds of
Right.
readings. So it's quite different.
Yeah, that's great. I didn't know that. I mean, it seems appropriate, of course, that you're going to need a more sensitive test following, surgery like that. Dennis, you had mentioned too, you were driving back home when you got that news, and you didn't know how to digest it yourself, and then you thought, how do I tell my wife? So people do wonder, how do others break the news to loved ones? Do you have any guidance or how you went about it?
It's a tough situation. Guys ask me about it all the time, and I say there's really 2 ways to look at it. I think if you have a good relationship with your wife, you'll probably share the information pretty quickly. Now, if you're in a situation where you're about to have a divorce, you may not want to share this information, and you may want to be doing some things to kind of protect assets and protect, whatever else you need to do so. So I've met men who, I've got a fellow actually who lives across the street from me, was diagnosed with prostate cancer and didn't want to tell his wife. And he's been married, didn't want to say anything about it, doesn't want to talk about it. If she asks him any questions, he says, I'm dealing with it. So there are men who feel that I'm going to keep this a big secret. There are men who say, I need to share the information. in a lot of the support groups that I run and I'm a part of, what I find is that most men, after they've been diagnosed and after they have surgery, are more willing to talk about it. But up until then, they're frightened of it. I had a financial advisor for a number of years. When I was going through my surgery, he said, "Hey, I'll come down to visit you at the hospital, et cetera, et cetera." Well, I was in and out in a day, so he never got a chance to. Well, about 3 months later, I find out that he is dying of prostate cancer. He never said a word, never said to me, "I'm going through the same thing." He didn't want to say anything because he was afraid his clients would abandon him. So that you'll find that men don't want to appear weak. They don't want to have an employer go, "We have a problem here, nice knowing you." So there's a lot of fear that way with men. So it's a balancing act, I think, depending upon your lifestyle and where you are in relationships with an employer as well as family members.
That is fascinating, to think about all those different situations, and yet not surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Dennis.
And it's only, after meeting so many men who have been through this,
Right.
and you hear different stories. And I had one man say to me, "I've got prostate cancer and my wife wants a divorce." And I said, "What's going on with that?" He said, "Well," she said, "I can't fulfill the marital contract anymore." And she said, "Since you can't do that, I want a divorce."
Wow.
So a loving lady, I guess,
Gosh.
but it was a strange occurrence. And you run into all kinds of stories.
Okay.
So I don't think there's any simple answer.
Right, absolutely not. There is no simple, there's also no singular experience. Everyone has his or her own, relationships to deal with. And so with you, Dennis, it sounds like you did tell your wife once
Yeah,
you found out. How
exactly.
were you able to break the news to her? How did you find the words? And
That was real easy. I came in the house and broke down and cried and said, "I've got bad news." And that was it. It was an emotional discharge because I had been building it up for almost 2.5 hours. And as soon as I walked through the front door, she looked at me and knew something was wrong.
yeah, that's. I know it was some years ago, but I'm sure it brings up those
Oh,
emotions.
yeah. Still
Um,
to this day, yes.
do you have any last thing you want to say, Dennis, just about, you've just been diagnosed, you just told your wife, how you were thinking about next steps? Were you thinking about second opinions? Were you thinking about how do I
I
tell
did.
other people?
I did. I thought about second opinions. And I think the thing about prostate cancer, and I think with most cancers, what I've run into, well, not the last one I ran into, which we'll talk about another time. But when you go in to a doctor, normally you have a cold or the flu or something, and they say, "Well, here, you need to take these drugs and you need to do this and stay home and drink tea and have chicken soup and you'll be fine." And with prostate cancer, the doctor says to you, "Okay, which treatment option do you want?" And here you sit, you and your wife, as the most uninformed decision makers medically, being asked, which decision do you want to save your life? And and you start out, well, what's the advantages or what are the advantages of surgery? What are the advantages or disadvantages of radiation? I asked whether I could do brachytherapy. You're familiar with that? Which is seed implantation. So, and they said, "No, you can't do that." Another option is something called watchful waiting or active surveillance. And there are differences with both of those. And the problem with that is if you have an aggressive cancer, watchful waiting is not really something smart to do. Brachytherapy was not because it possibly was an advanced cancer. So no seed implants. So Dennis, you have two options, radiation or surgery. And I said, "Well, if I do surgery, can I do radiation after?" And they said, "Yes." I said, "If I do radiation, can you do surgery after?" They said, "It's very difficult or almost impossible to do." So I said, "Okay, let's do surgery." But then got a second opinion and actually did the same thing. Doctor confirmed what it was and said, "I think you might want to go in and make your choice on surgery or radiation." Again, no one would make the recommendation. You have to choose your own course of action.
Okay.
So it's, what I would say to guys, if you're recently diagnosed, for God's sakes, don't go to the internet.
Right.
Because as soon as you get on the internet, you're finding out all kinds of things. There's a fellow, Dr. Patrick Walsh. I don't know if you know the name or not, but he's written several books on prostate cancer and has been considered one of the leading cutting edge physicians for prostate cancer, and has written a great book. And my suggestion would be to read that. It's thick. It's a big book. It looks like you're reading War and Peace, but he covers absolutely every aspect of it. And I think to sit down and in the calmness of your home and to go through it is a very valuable thing to do.
That's a wonderful recommendation. Thank you for that. So Dennis has just gone through explaining how he got diagnosed. Dennis, we're going to stop this video and move on to the actual surgery. So sit tight.